Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the creaking timber hallway of medieval Europe, where the air smells like smoke, cold wool, and just a hint of, I haven't showered since last Thursday. You stand at the doorway of a world wrapped in snow, peering out toward a northern frontier that most people of this era never see, except in their imagination. A chill drifts in, sharp, nose-pinching, the kind of cold that makes you immediately rethink every life choice that led you outside. And somewhere out there, in the great white unknown, looms a creature so strange, so enormous, that if you ever stumbled across it in real life, well, let's just say you probably won't survive this. But don't worry. Tonight, you stay warm, safe, and comfortably horizontal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing the little constellation of nighttime listeners scattered around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward through this medieval corridor, boots crunching on straw meant to freshen the floor, an approach that definitely feels more performative than effective. Outside, the world lies under a quilt of snow that's been stitched together by long, endless winters. Europeans of this era live mostly in small pockets of warmth, hearth fires glowing inside timber homes, taverns humming with low conversation, monasteries echoing with whispered prayers. And despite their familiarity with the natural world, there's one region they know almost nothing about, the far, far north, where ice rules and the sun seems to forget its duties for half the year. Still, the imagination of medieval Europe is powerful. People tell stories about the North like it's a stage reserved exclusively for giants, spirits, and creatures that should honestly come with a user manual. You wade through drifting snow, passing travelers who clutch their cloaks tight, muttering about lands where daylight barely appears, where the sea freezes solid, and where animals grow impossibly large. One mainstream historical fact you pick up along the way. Medieval Europeans truly did believe that the world grew stranger the farther you traveled from the Mediterranean. The civilized center sat in warm, familiar lands. Beyond that, things got improvisational. And so, when merchants and sailors return with stories of giant white beasts, creatures that stalk icy coasts and glide through black Arctic waters like ghostly hunters, the people here don't have much existing knowledge to compare it to. The only bear most Europeans know is the brown variety, which tends to shuffle around forests, pilfer honey, and occasionally ruin someone's afternoon. But a bear that's white? A bear that swims? A bear that looks like it was carved out of frost itself? That's something else entirely. You make your way through a small square, lanterns flickering, voices thick with curiosity. People cluster around travelers who spin tales of creatures with fur so pale it disappears into the snow. Creatures that stalk seals across ice sheets, creatures that sometimes rise from the water like living chunks of glacier. A quirky tidbit the locals swear by. Some say these creatures glow in the moonlight, which is less biological reality and more a symptom of medieval observers standing too close to reflective snow while being, frankly, kind of sleep-deprived. Every new passing rumor builds the sense that the North is not simply distant. It's enchanted, dangerous, and mostly unknowable. Yet that doesn't stop the medieval mind from trying to categorize everything, usually through the lens of theology, symbolism, and whatever old book survived the last fire. Even now you hear an argument near a well. Is the giant white beast of the north more like a bear, a wolf, or possibly one of those mythic creatures monks warn about? Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed these early reports described a unique species, or whether they initially assumed it was just an unusually frosty-looking brown bear that needed moisturizer. You continue forward into a small monastery library where tapestries block the drafts, but fail miserably. A monk hunched over a candle is sketching something that looks like a bear stuffed inside a sheep costume, a noble attempt at visual accuracy. This is where knowledge spreads in medieval Europe, slowly, carefully, and often decorated with flourishes that definitely didn't exist in nature. The monk glances at you as if hoping you won't judge his bear. You reassure him mentally. You've seen worse on the internet. Life here is quiet, yet full of anxieties. People cling to any information they can get about distant lands because the world is vast and confusing. Maps end abruptly. Legends mix with facts. And every new story from sailors adds another brushstroke to the mental portrait of the North. Right now, those sailors are describing something big, snow-white, and potentially aggressive. So naturally, the safest option for medieval folks is to drop it into a familiar category and hope for the best. Bear seems reasonable enough, but as you'll soon see, this classification doesn't stay simple for long. You slip outside again into the muffled silence of winter. Snowflakes drift lazily down, swirling in soft spirals that brush your face with tiny icy pinpricks. The cold bites, but in a gentle, almost cozy way, the kind that makes you want to burrow deeper into thick blankets later. You watch the pale horizon fade into blue, and for a moment you imagine yourself standing on a northern ice floe, staring across a world where humans are fragile newcomers and giant white predators glide like phantoms. Here in medieval Europe, however, people don't yet realize that this creature, the polar bear, is built for survival in a place humans can barely visit. They know only that something tremendous lives out there in the cold, and that its existence challenges their neat categories. If a creature swims like a seal, prowls like a bear, and looks like walking snow, what is it? As you move toward the next village, a tired traveler waves at you from the side of the road, offering you a piece of hard black bread that seems like an early attempt at edible masonry. You decline gently. He shrugs and mutters that creatures in the north don't have to worry about such bland food. They can eat whatever they want, and you can almost hear the whisper of a massive paw crunching into ice, the soft huff of a breath that fogs the Arctic air. The medieval world is prepared to believe almost anything about these beasts. They haven't seen them, but they've heard enough to be thoroughly impressed. And soon, because of one very specific set of religious rules, this snowy giant is about to become part of an argument no one in the north saw coming. You drift forward, the snow thinning as your feet carry you toward something stranger than the cold itself, the edge of medieval knowledge. It's quiet here, the kind of quiet that makes you reflexively whisper, even though no one is listening. You follow the curve of a tattered parchment map pinned to a market stall, its corners fluttering in the breeze like it's trying to escape the responsibility of accuracy. The map sprawls out in warm browns and dim blues, and you quickly notice a theme. The more north you look, the less anyone pretends to know what's going on. You trace the jagged line of a coastline before it simply dissolves into blank space, as if the cartographer threw up his quill and muttered, good enough. Medieval maps often end this way, abruptly, confidently, and with a complete absence of shame. That's your mainstream historical fact here. Cartographers of this era rarely had first-hand data. Instead, they stitched together second-hand tales, classical texts, and occasionally pure creative flair. And speaking of flair, you step closer to examine the colorful beasts scattered throughout the margins. They lounge across the map like they're posing for a medieval calendar shoot. Serpents twisting around compass roses, fish with far too many teeth, and something that looks suspiciously like a lion that lost a bet with a fish tail. You blink twice. The drawing of a polar bear would almost fit in here perfectly, but instead of a bear, you see a lumpy white blob labeled with something you can't read because medieval handwriting wasn't designed for mortal eyes. A merchant nearby chuckles at your curiosity. "That one," he says proudly, "sea wolf." You nod politely, even though the creature he pointed at looks like the world's first attempt at drawing a pillow. The map's top edge curls like an old toenail, and just beyond it lies a patch of pure blankness. Not blue for water, not brown for land, just nothing. Medieval Europeans treated blank map spaces less like unexplored regions and more like storyboarding opportunities, and you can almost feel the anticipation radiating from the parchment, as if the emptiness itself is daring someone to imagine what lives there. A quirky tidbit floats through your mind as you stare. Some medieval sailors believed the far north held a giant magnetic mountain that could rip the iron nails right out of their ships, which is an oddly specific fear that tells you someone had a very bad boat day. Whether they truly believe such stories varies, and historians still argue whether these tales were earnest reports or the medieval equivalent of sailors yelling, "Watch this," after 3 pints. You step back and inhale the crisp air, hearing snippets of conversation from a group of travelers arguing over the creatures said to lurk at the edges of the world. One insists the seas up north are filled with fish larger than houses. Another claims the sun itself behaves weirdly there, sometimes refusing to set for days. You could try to correct them with modern science, but that would be like trying to explain Wi-Fi to a chicken. Best to let the stories breathe. You meander toward a workshop where a cartographer sits hunched over his table. His brush glides in delicate strokes, painting a new map destined to be both beautiful and hopelessly inaccurate. He squints at his parchment, muttering about the northern regions. "Cold," he says, "and full of things that aren't quite beasts and aren't quite spirits." You watch him as he adds a bear-like figure standing on its hind legs in the upper margins. The shape is off, like he combined a wolf, a cow, and maybe a snowdrift for reference. You gently clear your throat, and the cartographer glances up. "Ah," he says, "you're looking at the creature from those sailors' tales. Lives on ice, hunts in water, big as a horse, hair like snow, teeth like death." You nod slowly, mostly impressed that medieval maritime gossip survived long enough to be immortalized in watercolor. The cartographer dips his brush again. "Some say," he continues, "that the north is so cold the animals there become different kinds of beings. They shed their old nature. The land itself changes them." He shrugs, as if morphological transformation were just a normal part of climate adaptation, which, okay, to be fair, it kind of is, but perhaps not to the dramatic degree he imagines. As you walk on, you feel the world around you fading into that strange liminal zone where guesswork becomes reality. Every medieval map you pass reinforces the same idea. The North is mystery made physical. Nobody quite knows what's there, but they know it's something fascinating and probably dangerous. This uncertainty leaves enough wiggle room for polar bears to enter the European imagination not as biological organisms, but as mythic figures lurking at Earth's edge. You wander into a small tavern, the warmth hitting you like a cozy brick. Patrons sit near the fire, leaning over wooden mugs filled with something that tastes like ale and self-regret. A weather-worn sailor gestures wildly as he retells a story, his hand slicing the air like he's trying to karate chop the memory into shape. White as winter itself, he says. Big paws, black nose, and eyes like coals burning through the fog. Another sailor interrupts, waving a finger. Nonsense. The beast is part whale. Saw one dive straight into the sea. No bear does that. You sip the drink someone offers you. It's terrible. And listen as the sailors argue whether the creature is a bear, a fish, or some bizarre hybrid nature cooked up on a slow day. You're beginning to see how such confusion would eventually give rise to creative classification. The tavern door creaks open again, and a blast of cold air sweeps in along with another traveler carrying a rolled-up map case. He unravels the parchment on the table. And there it is, an ocean that gradually fades into crisp white nothing, dotted with drawings of men fighting animals that are honestly way too large. You think to yourself how strangely comforting the emptiness looks. The map seems to promise that beyond the world you know is a place untouched, untamed, and unbothered by human opinions. In that emptiness, medieval imagination thrives. It shapes northern beasts into monstrous silhouettes and turns simple observations, like a bear swimming, into signs of some deeper mystery. You've walked through cities where knowledge is built like patchwork, stitched out of travelers' accounts, inherited texts, and wild speculations. And now, staring at the far north margins once more, you realize something important. This world didn't operate on scientific precision. It operated on vibes. As you step back into the night, snow falling softly around you, the map's monsters linger in your mind. The north remains undefined, unmeasured, uncharted, and into that blankness, polar bears glide effortlessly, becoming whatever medieval Europeans needed them to be. Giants, spirits, sea wolves, or perhaps something fishy in ways no one expects yet. Now you feel the pull to wander further toward that empty edge, letting the white nothing draw you in. The story flows on, and you follow. You shuffle onward, the tavern's warmth fading behind you as the chill of the medieval street settles back onto your shoulders like an overbearing ant, insisting you need just one more layer. Your feet guide you toward a stone church rising from the snow, its bell tower looming above the rooftops like a judgmental finger. The air around it is thick with incense and the kind of solemnity that makes you instinctively walk quieter, even if you're pretty sure you haven't done anything wrong in at least the last 5 minutes. Inside, the glow of candles paints soft halos on the walls. You drift past rows of benches filled with townsfolk huddled in cloaks, their breath forming little clouds as they listen to a priest delivering a sermon that seems to have entered its 3rd hour without showing signs of stopping. The topic? Fasting, food rules, what counts as meat, what doesn't. It's riveting in the way that watching a glacier melt is riveting, slow, cold, and very committed. Still, you take your seat near the back because this part of the story matters. Medieval Europe runs on rules, and fasting rules are among the most intricate. That's your mainstream historical fact. The church divided foods into categories based on their nature, and this classification determined what people could eat on certain days. Meat from land animals? Forbidden. Fish? Totally fine. Anything in between? Welcome to a theological nightmare. The priest leans forward, gripping the pulpit like he's holding on during turbulence. Remember, he intones, meat warms the blood and excites earthly passions. You raise an eyebrow. Fish, on the other hand, is considered cool and calm, the kind of food that wouldn't encourage anyone to start a medieval bar fight. You can't help but smirk. If only the priest could see a modern sushi restaurant during happy hour. A frazzled clerk standing at the side has a scroll listing acceptable fasting foods, scribbled in handwriting that gets progressively more chaotic, probably because he's had to rewrite the exceptions list several times. You peek over his shoulder and spot some truly questionable choices. Beavers, for instance, are on the fish list because, quirky tidbit coming your way, their tails look scaly, and they spend so much time in water that clerics labeled them semi-fish, which is medieval logic at its absolute peak. The clerk sighs deeply. Do we leave room, he mutters, for animals that swim and walk, for beasts whose nature is unclear? You watch the priest preach while the clerk scribbles, and it becomes obvious that this particular food classification system wasn't designed to handle Arctic megafauna. As you sit there, your mind drifts to a story whispered earlier, sailors describing enormous white creatures that hunt on ice, stalk seals, and disappear beneath freezing waves. If you're living in medieval Europe, surrounded by rules that sort animals like groceries, this raises a spicy theological question. Is the polar bear a land animal, or is it technically a fish? Historians still argue whether medieval theologians took this classification seriously, or whether they treated it with the same energy you apply to clicking "I agree" on a terms of service document. But one thing is clear. The question came up, and it mattered. The priest shifts the topic to penance, which is about as fun as it sounds. People here genuinely fear accidentally eating something forbidden, as if divine judgment lurks behind every kitchen pot. You imagine a medieval confessional where someone nervously whispers, "Forgive me, Father, for I may have eaten the tail of something that swims but also growls." The priest nods gravely. How crunchy was it? This is why you don't write medieval theology textbooks. The sermon spills into a discussion of moral symbolism. Medieval folks loved reading spiritual meaning into animals. Owls symbolize sin, sheep innocence, lions Christ, and you? You're mostly just cold. The priest describes fish as symbols of purity and endurance. Bears, on the other hand, symbolize wildness, brute force, and occasionally gluttony, depending on which book you ask. You glance up at a stained glass window showing a fish surrounded by radiant beams, looking strangely smug. Meanwhile, a carved wooden bear on the opposite wall looks like it's plotting the overthrow of the fish's divine supremacy. This theological tug-of-war sets the stage for the confusion to come. If a polar bear swims like a fish but growls like a bear, which symbolic team does it belong to? The sermon ends with everyone murmuring prayers, and you quietly slip outside before someone locks the doors and guilt traps you into staying longer. The snowy village appears calmer now, people returning home to prepare meals carefully curated to avoid breaking the fasting rules. You pass a woman stirring a cauldron of something that smells like fish, but looks like a dare. You wander toward a little workshop behind the church where the same frazzled clerk is now warming his hands over a brazier. He's muttering to himself as he organizes scrolls labeled with categories such as allowed on Fridays, not allowed ever, and please don't ask about these. He looks up at you, squinting like he's trying to remember if you're supposed to be helping or confessing. You hear those sailors talking? He asks suddenly. About the white ice creature? You nod. He rubs his face. If that beast hunts in water, if it swims like a seal, if it lives more in the sea than on land. He groans. We might have to classify it as fish. You can't tell if he's joking or catastrophizing. Probably both. He digs through a pile of documents and pulls out a parchment filled with notes. You spot familiar words. Ursus maritimus, sea bear. That's not a medieval term, but the concept existed. People genuinely debated whether a swimming bear was still a bear for fasting purposes or whether it slipped into the fish category like a loophole on pause. The clerk sighs again. I swear, he mutters, one day someone's going to show up asking whether a polar bear can be eaten on a Friday, and I will simply walk into the sea. You pat his shoulder sympathetically. He looks like a man who has spent his life trying to organize the world and realizing the world refuses to sit still. You leave him to his scrolls and wander back into the frozen air. Across the snowy rooftops, you imagine a distant Arctic horizon, the silhouette of a massive white creature emerging from the water, a bearer of contradictions waddling straight toward Europe's neat, fragile system of categories. In the soft glow of moonlight, you begin to understand how a creature could become more than an animal, how it could become an exception, a loophole, a theological headache. And as you continue on your path, snow crunching beneath your boots, you sense that this fish or not fish debate is only getting started. You drift away from the churchyard, brushing frost from your sleeves as you follow a narrow path that winds between huts and sheds, their roofs sagging under blankets of snow. The wind hums softly, a low, tired sound like it's been working overtime since the last ice age. Ahead of you glows a small window, warm light spilling through the frosty glass like melted honey. Your feet carry you toward it almost automatically, because if there's one thing medieval Europe understands, it's the universal human desire to not freeze solid. Inside, the room is lined with shelves sagging beneath the weight of enormous hand-copied books. This is a scriptorium, part library, part workshop, part please don't spill ink on anything or someone will cry. A few monks sit hunched over wooden desks, quills scratching in slow arcs as they copy manuscripts one careful stroke at a time. You feel the hush settle over you, a softness that almost makes you want to yawn. Perfect bedtime ambiance. One of the monks waves you over with a small, ink-smudged hand. He looks like someone who hasn't seen sunlight since last summer. His desk holds one of the most peculiar treasures of medieval knowledge, an illustrated bestiary. That's your mainstream historical fact. Bestiaries were wildly popular in the Middle Ages, acting as both natural history guides and moral instruction manuals. Science plus sermon, if you will. The monk opens the heavy pages, and you're greeted with animals both familiar and fantastical. Lions that stare nobly into the distance, birds that look suspiciously like overconfident chickens, creatures from classical legends, and all of them appear slightly off. You suspect the artists were working from vague descriptions, no references, and maybe one blurry memory from childhood. He flips to a page showing a bear, brown, lumpy, and shaped like someone had described a bear to an artist who had only ever seen dogs. Here, the monk whispers, the bear is a symbol of anger and ferocity. You note, with quiet amusement, that if this bear symbolizes anything, it's that medieval zoology needed glasses. But then he turns the page to something you weren't expecting. Not a polar bear, because bestiaries rarely included animals unknown to Europe, but a creature said to live in icy lands far to the north. The illustration shows a big white beast that looks like a sheep wearing armor. It's labeled with a name that roughly translates to northern white bear, though it's clearly an imaginative leap rather than biological observation. Reports came from merchants, the monk murmurs. They said the creature was white as God's own snow, fierce as judgment. He pauses. Also, it swims. You glance at him. Swims? He nods gravely, as if this is not the least bit strange. You watch his quill hover over the text as he writes a short description mixing fact, rumor, symbolism, and a dash of storytelling. This is the quirky tidbit the medieval imagination excelled at, turning animals into moral lessons. A white bear becomes a symbol of purity and danger, a reminder that innocence can still bite. You can almost hear a medieval parent telling their kid, "Be virtuous, or the snow bear will get you." The monk leans back, satisfied with his work. "Animals teach," he says softly. "Every creature's nature reveals something divine." This is why medieval knowledge feels so dreamlike. Animals are not just animals. Each one is a walking parable with fur. But another monk at the far table suddenly pipes up, adjusting his spectacles. "I've heard," he says, "that some of those northern beasts are more whale than bear." The first monk rolls his eyes. "Nonsense." "Not nonsense," the second monk insists. "A sailor told me they leap into the sea and vanish beneath the waves." You can tell he's proud of this detail, like he's holding a rare Pokemon card. You can't help but smile. Historians still argue whether these bestiary accounts tell us anything factual about real polar bears, or whether they reflect sailors confused by glimpses of white hide against ice, or even misidentifications of seals, white wolves, or chunks of iceberg shaped exactly wrong at exactly the wrong time. The monks continue debating, and you drift among the shelves. Books lie open on desks, works by classical authors, translations of earlier naturalists, treatises on strange foreign creatures. Most of the information here comes from reading rather than seeing. Observation is optional. Confidence is not. You pause at a manuscript that shows the manticore, a creature with a human face, lion body, and scorpion tail. Next to it sits a description written in a very neat hand, possibly exaggerated. You deeply appreciate this monk's honesty. As you turn back to the polar bearish illustration, you begin to see how knowledge spreads in this era, slowly, patchily, with borders between fact and fantasy as soft as snow drifts. When reports of real polar bears trickled into Europe through traders, scribes had to fold them into existing frameworks. And most frameworks here involve symbolism, moral lessons, or classical authority. There's no dedicated Arctic mammals shelf. You imagine how polar bears must have appeared in the medieval mind, ghostly creatures from the realm of cold itself. They stalk the boundaries of maps, slipping between sea and land, challenging every tidy rule the church tries to impose. If a creature is both a swimmer and a predator. What is it? If it hunts like a wolf but lives on ice, where does it fit in moral symbolism? The monks debate this in their gentle voices while you drift past their desks, listening. One claims the white bear symbolizes spiritual vigilance in snowy lands. Another insists it represents the soul's struggle against temptation. A third mutters that it's simply a big cold bear and everyone should calm down. You lean over one manuscript showing seals drawn with human faces, an unfortunate artistic choice, and wonder how many early polar bear depictions were equally creative. Probably most. These artists work from stories, not specimens. No one here has seen an actual polar bear, and if they ever did, they would likely not live to return with detailed notes. Still, the scribes preserve every whisper, every rumor, every merchant's boast. They fold these fragments into books designed to teach people not only about animals, but about how to be moral humans. And in doing so, they accidentally create a world where beasts from the Arctic become ink and parchment legends instead of flesh and fur predators. You step outside again, the door closing with a soft thump behind you. The snow glows pale under the night sky. In the silence, you see how medieval Europeans didn't simply misunderstand the polar bear, they reinvented it, turning it into a creature shaped as much by imagination as by reality. As you walk onward, the scriptorium fading in the distance, you feel the story stretching ahead like a white path on fresh snow, guiding you deeper into the strange world where ideas matter as much as animals, and sometimes even more. You follow a narrow road out of town, the snow beneath your boots crunching like you're stepping through a giant bowl of stale cereal. The wind has quieted to a soft hum, like it's finally settled into a comfortable nap. Ahead, the land slopes downward to a small harbor where wooden ships bob gently in icy water. Torches flicker along the docks, casting long shadows that sway with each creaking rope. This is where stories are born, not in tidy libraries or solemn churches, but in the mouths of people who've actually seen the edges of the world. You make your way down to the pier as a group of sailors finishes unloading their ship. They look weather-beaten in the way only people who've been slapped repeatedly by Arctic winds can. Their beards have frost patterns in them, unintentional fashion choices courtesy of the northern sea. You edge a little closer, drawn by the soft murmur of storytelling that wafts from their huddle. One of the sailors, the kind of man who looks like he could wrestle a walrus and then complain about the walrus's technique, leans in and lowers his voice. "Up there," he whispers, "the world is different." He taps the side of his head as if the North has personally rearranged his thoughts. You settle down on a crate, the wood cold beneath you. The sailor gestures with both hands, painting a picture in the air. "We saw it on the ice," he says. "A giant thing, white as moonlit foam. It looked like the snow had stood up and grown teeth." You feel the tiny hairs on your arms stand up, not in fear, but in that tingly way bedtime stories get under your skin. He continues, "It moved quiet, too quiet, like the snow didn't dare crunch beneath it." Another sailor chimes in, eyes wide, "The beast swims, not like a clumsy cow in a river. No, it glides, slips under the water like it belongs there." He shivers dramatically. "That's not normal bear behavior." You nod slowly, and there's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval Europeans learned about polar bears not through direct observation, but through fragmented tales brought by sailors, traders, and explorers who skirted the edges of the Arctic. Real encounters were rare, and usually so terrifying that the details came back warped by adrenaline and half-frozen memory. The sailors describe icy landscapes that sound more like fantasy than geography. Endless fields of white, the sun hovering low like it forgot how to set, and nights where the stars blaze so fiercely they feel closer than the sea. In such a place, seeing a massive white predator would feel like encountering a ghost. A quirky tidbit emerges as one sailor, clearly the group comedian, leans forward. Heard a man swear the beast can smell a seal through 3 feet of ice. Another sailor scoffs. 3? 5, at least. You chuckle, quietly imagining a medieval argument escalating because nobody brought a tape measure. These men aren't trying to deceive anyone. They're simply trying to put the indescribable into words. Their stories mix reality with embellishment, because that's how memory behaves after frostbite and terror. You watch their faces illuminated by the torchlight, and you sense how easily tales like these drift into taverns, monasteries, and city squares, where they melt into the cultural imagination. And of course, storytelling has a life of its own. One sailor describes hearing something on the ice, heavy footsteps, then silence. Like it vanished, he says, like the creature could disappear into the snow itself. Another sailor leans in, saw it rear up on its hind legs, tall as a house. He gestures upward, exaggerating the height to at least 3 stories. The others nod gravely, as if this is scientifically confirmed. Historians still argue whether medieval listeners interpreted such descriptions literally, or whether they recognized a hint of exaggeration and simply enjoyed the drama. Hard to tell from this vantage point, especially when you're watching a man pantomime a bear taller than his ship. You glance toward the open sea, the dark water rippling under the moonlight. It's easy to imagine a pale shape moving just beneath the surface, something enormous and powerful. You picture a polar bear slipping into the water, fur shimmering with icy droplets, an apex predator made for this frozen world. A woman approaches the group carrying a basket of dried fish. She listens to a snippet of their conversation, then shakes her head. "One day," she says, "you men will come home with stories about fish that walk on land." A sailor shrugs. "Maybe one day we will." And honestly, given medieval Europe's track record of believing barnacle geese grow from driftwood, you don't doubt someone would buy that story. The sailors move to a fire pit, warming their hands as they continue recounting the strange things they've seen. Icebergs cracking like thunder, lights dancing in the northern sky, nights where the air freezes your eyelashes together. You wrap your coat tighter around your shoulders, even though you're pretty sure your eyelashes are safe. In their voices, the North becomes a place where laws, natural and otherwise, get blurry. If the creatures up there swim, walk, climb, and hunt in ways no European animal does, then maybe they don't fit into normal categories at all. Maybe they belong to a part of the world where definitions bend and slip like sea ice. One sailor pokes the fire thoughtfully. "We called it a sea bear," he says, "but truth is, we don't know what it is." That ambiguity hangs in the air as the flames crackle softly. You leave the sailors behind and wander farther along the coast. The tide is low, exposing patches of seaweed that glisten in the moonlight. You pause, listening to the rhythmic lap of waves against the shore. With every step, you feel as though you're following the sailors' stories into that far white expanse, into a world where imagination fills every blank space left by limited knowledge. A gust of cold wind brushes past you, and for a split second, you almost imagine seeing something large moving far out on the water, a shape that blends with the darkness until you're no longer sure if it was ever really there. You blink slowly. The night quiets, and you understand now. The whispers of the North didn't simply inform Europe. They enchanted it. They made polar bears into creatures of mystery long before they became subjects of science. And soon enough, these whispers would collide with religious rules, eager theologians, and an entire system of medieval logic that was absolutely not prepared for a giant snowy meat-eater that swims like a fish. But that part of the journey waits just ahead. You leave the harbor behind, the muffled sounds of sailors fading like the last echoes of a dream. You're not sure you fully understood. The path slopes gently upward, leading you toward the next cluster of homes. Quiet, lamplit windows glowing with the kind of warmth that makes you want to curl up inside with a bowl of something steamy and unidentifiable. Your steps crunch through the thin crust of snow as you wander onward, and for a moment, all you hear is your own breath mingling with the soft whisper of winter. Soon, you find yourself drawn toward a small gathering outside a merchant's house. A few villagers stand in the cold, bundled so tightly in wool that they look like ambulatory bales of fabric. At the center of the group sits a wooden cart, propped with crates full of dried fish, salted meats, and something pale and chunky that you really hope is cheese, but has the unsettling aura of mystery meat. The merchant, a broad, rosy-cheeked man, waves his hands dramatically as he tells a story, the audience leaning closer with the intensity of people who have exactly zero other forms of entertainment. You inch in quietly, and the merchant's voice drops to a whisper. "So there we were," he says, staring at this enormous white creature with paws the size of shields, and old Thomas asks the most important question of the whole journey. The merchant pauses for effect. He asks, "Can we eat it during Lent?" The crowd bursts into laughter, and you can't help but smile. Here it is, the great medieval "is it meat?" dilemma. And though the laughter feels light-hearted, the question itself is very real. For a society built around close religious regulation of food, what you could and couldn't eat on specific days mattered a lot. This is your mainstream historical fact. The Church's fasting laws shaped medieval diets more than climate, geography, or personal taste. On fasting days, Fridays, Lent, Advent, certain vigils, Christians were forbidden from eating meat from warm-blooded land animals. Animals that lived in or came from the water were fair game, which, yes, made medieval classification feel like a biological game show where animals must choose their category carefully or risk excommunication. You wander a little closer as a woman in a thick fur shawl raises her hand. "But what about creatures that live in both?" she asks. The merchant nods solemnly. "Ah, yes," he says, "the troublesome ones, the beavers, the otters, the seals." And now, he leans in, "these enormous white ice creatures." Some villagers murmur thoughtfully. One man scratches his beard, another shrugs and says, "If it swims, I call it a fish," which is not the worst logic given the time period. It even resembles the reasoning that once convinced clerics to declare beavers edible during fasting because their tails looked kind of scale-ish, a quirky tidbit you can't help but recall with a tiny chuckle. You watch the debate unfold as villagers toss out guesses, opinions, and theological interpretations like they're playing a medieval version of charades where the answer is always bear, but no one wants to commit. Terms like nature, habitat, and God's intention get thrown around. Nobody agrees. Everybody's cold. One person claims the creature must be a fish because anything that big in the water has to be. Another insists it's definitely a beast of the land because it has legs, doesn't it? Someone else suggests it might be an angelic sign, but the merchant gently steers that theory away before it gains traction. He already has enough trouble selling fish without divine beings entering the conversation. You grin to yourself. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed polar bears were part fish or whether they simply treated them as permissible to eat loopholes in extremely cold regions where dietary rules needed flexibility. Evidence leans both ways, depending on the location and the decade. And witnessing the uncertainty here, you can see how easy it would be for ambiguity to become doctrine. You drift back onto the road, following it as the moonlight spills silver across the snow. The air feels colder now, sharper, each breath a reminder of the difficulty people in Northern Europe faced when fasting seasons collided with the harsh reality of winter food scarcity. You imagine what it must feel like living off dried fish and hope, wishing someone would bring home a fresh seal or a chunk of bear meat, even if the church wasn't thrilled about it. A thought flickers in your mind. Polar bears were rare enough in medieval Europe that most people never had to seriously consider their classification. But they existed enough in stories, trade goods, occasional hunts, that the question loomed. If a creature swims most of the time, hunts sea mammals, and lives practically on water, what do you call it? You continue walking until the road leads you to a small cottage glowing with firelight. Curious voices spill out from the open window. You peer inside to find a family sitting near the hearth, passing around a sealed letter. The father clears his throat dramatically. "It's from my cousin in Trondheim," he announces, and he writes that people up north sometimes treat the great white bear as fish during Lent. Gasps ripple through the room. "What?" says the mother, clutching her shawl. "Well," the father says, "he says they live in the water, so the argument is that technically, they're sea beasts." The children look delighted. Maybe because the idea of eating something huge and terrifying during Lent feels like a cheat code. The grandmother squints suspiciously. "I don't like it," she mutters. "Bears are bears. If God wanted bears to be fish, he'd have given them gills." Fair point. You drift away again, your footsteps drawing you toward the fields where frost coats every blade of grass. And as you walk, you feel the philosophical weight of this moment pressing gently but persistently on you. Medieval Europeans didn't just classify animals. They interpreted them. They tried to understand their essence, their God-given role. So a creature that exists in two worlds, land and sea, scrambled the system. You imagine a cleric pacing in a distant monastery, anxiously trying to decide where polar bears belong, flipping through bestiaries that offer zero help. You picture a scholar scribbling notes, trying to fit the creature into Aristotelian categories, like someone forcing the wrong puzzle piece into a puzzle because lunch is in 10 minutes. You envision hunters in the north shrugging and saying, "Look, it swims. We're calling it fish." End of discussion. In the end, the dilemma boils down to this. A creature's behavior could redefine its classification, and the polar bear, with its surprising grace in the water and its seal-heavy diet, nudged itself perilously close to fish territory, not because of science, not because of biology, but because survival and theology had to make peace somehow. You reach a small wooden footbridge and pause. Beneath it, a frozen stream glimmers under the moonlight, solid and silent. The air feels still enough to hear your own heartbeat, and you sense that this debate, the great is it meat dilemma, isn't just academic. It shapes the next turn in the story, pushing medieval Europe toward a conclusion stranger and more fascinating than anyone expects. You breathe softly, watching your breath cloud into the cold air. And then you keep walking. You follow the road as it drifts away from the quiet cottages, the snow now glittering beneath a thin wash of moonlight, like someone scattered ground-up pearls across the landscape. The world feels hushed, expectant, like it's leaning in to hear what happens next. And so are you, because tonight you're walking straight into the moment where medieval logic and polar bear reality collide head-on in a spectacularly goofy theological tangle. Your boots crunch through the frost as you approach a hill crowned by a small monastery, a squat stone building with smoke curling lazily from its chimney. A handful of monks stand outside, wrapped in thick wool cloaks, and from the sound of murmured debate, you can tell they're either discussing something very important or arguing over which saint invented stew. You draw closer, just as one monk throws up his hands. "I'm telling you," he insists, "if the beast lives most of its life in water, it can't be a land animal." Another monk, squinting fiercely, counters, "But it breathes air. That's what separates beasts from fish." A third monk, clearly the mediator, sighs with the defeated energy of someone who has refereed this argument every day for 2 weeks. You settle near the group as unobtrusively as possible and listen. Turns out, this is not a casual debate. It's a serious attempt to classify the polar bear within the church's dietary laws, and the stakes feel oddly high. Not because the monks expect to meet a polar bear anytime soon, thankfully, but because their decision could influence food rules for entire northern communities. One monk pulls out a scroll covered in neat handwriting. "Let us review its properties," he declares, sounding like he's about to present a TED Talk for the year 1243. Large, white, eats seals, lives on ice, and, he taps the parchment emphatically, is an excellent swimmer. He pauses, which is deeply troubling. You stifle a laugh. And here comes your mainstream historical fact. Medieval classifications of animals often considered behavior and environment just as important as anatomy. If an animal spent most of its time in water, that mattered, sometimes more than whether it technically had fur or gave live birth. One monk takes a deep, dramatic breath. "The creature," he says solemnly, "moves through water as gracefully as a fish." Another nods. "Yes, I have heard it dives beneath the surface. A bear that swims is unnatural." You think of modern documentaries showing polar bears plunging into icy seas with elegant power, and you can't help but smile. Medieval Europe would have lost its collective mind watching planet Earth. The monks herd you inside before you freeze solid, guiding you to a long wooden table covered in manuscripts, quills, wax tablets, and half-eaten bread that definitely violates at least 3 food safety guidelines. They resume their debate with renewed enthusiasm. "It hunts seals," says one monk. "Seals are fish." "Seals are not fish," another corrects. "They are seal." This clarification does not help anyone, least of all the monks. Another monk steps forward with a flourish, holding up a parchment depicting a polar bear in the least flattering art style possible. It looks like an angry marshmallow with legs. "If God made the beast white," he says confidently, "that is a sign it belongs to the cold waters, and thus to the fish." You blink. That's a theological leap worthy of the Olympics. But here comes your quirky tidbit. Medieval thinkers occasionally reclassified animals based on habitat alone. Beavers were part fish because they swam. Barnacle geese were believed to hatch from driftwood because no one saw them nesting. Otters were water beasts, sometimes acceptable to eat during fasting seasons. So the idea of a water-loving bear sliding into the fish category, not as weird to them as it is to you. The debate intensifies. One monk declares, "If the creature catches its prey underwater, perhaps its soul is more fish than beast." Another monk counters, "It nurses its young. No fish does that." A third mutters, "But have you ever seen a fish not nurse its young?" Everyone groans. Outside the window, snow drifts against the wall in slow, whispery spirals. The fire crackles softly. You watch the monks argue themselves into a theological labyrinth, chasing ideas around like puppies circling their tails. Historians still argue whether these debates were widespread or isolated, whether the fish classification was made formally in some regions or simply became a practical workaround for communities living where fish were limited, but bears were less limited. Records suggest both possibilities, though no universal decree ever seems to have been issued. But documents from northern clerics do hint at surprising flexibility, especially when survival was on the line. You sit quietly as they open one more manuscript, a book of canon law. The pages flip rapidly until one monk whispers, "Aha!" and jabs his finger at a paragraph. Any creature of the sea whose sustenance comes from the deep may be counted among fish. Instant silence. They all stare at the line like it's a sign from heaven, or a loophole big enough to walk a polar bear through. One monk raises his quill. "It lives on the ice." Another nods. "It hunts in the sea." A third adds, "It swims often and well." The oldest monk clears his throat. "Therefore, might we consider it—" He hesitates, choosing his words carefully. "Fish adjacent." The room exhales. Fish adjacent. A classification only medieval Europe could invent. The argument winds down. One monk slumps into his chair, exhausted. Another rubs his temples. They all look like they've run an intellectual marathon in sandals. Finally, the eldest monk announces, "Very well. Until further knowledge arrives from the north, the white sea bear may be treated as—" A long, dramatic pause. "Fish for fasting purposes." You stare at them, speechless, realizing you've just witnessed a watershed moment in medieval animal taxonomy. The monks record their decision carefully, ink drying slowly on the page. It feels final, even though it's deeply provisional. Medieval science at its finest. You step back outside into the cold night. The sky stretches dark and vast overhead, the stars glinting like distant ice crystals. You picture a polar bear somewhere far away, sliding into the ocean with powerful strokes, blissfully unaware that a group of robed scholars has just welcomed it into the aquatic community. And as you descend the hill, snow crunching beneath your boots, you realize the world just became a little stranger and a lot more entertaining. You drift down from the monastery hill, your boots crunching lightly through powdery snow as a soft wind nudges at your cloak like a sleepy cat trying to get comfortable. Behind you, the monks' voices fade into the night, leaving you alone with the lingering absurdity that somewhere, somehow, a bear has just been taxonomically nudged into the fish category. It's a thought both hilarious and oddly charming, like watching someone try to organize a bookshelf by color and then panicking when they find a rainbow-striped spine. The village below glows with warm lamplight, and your steps carry you toward a squat stone building near the center square. Its door stands slightly ajar, letting out a slice of golden firelight, scribbling faint shadows on the snow. Curiosity, your constant travel companion, pulls you forward. Inside you find a cramped room crammed with parchment rolls, ledgers, quills, and ink pots arranged in what can only be described as an aggressively optimistic idea of organization. Clerks shuffle around like anxious penguins, their robes brushing low desks and stacks of documents. You catch the rhythmic scratching of quills and the low murmur of accountants doing mental gymnastics. You step closer to the main table, where a clerk with tired eyes and a charmingly frazzled hairline is bent over a ledger. He glances up at you briefly, just long enough to evaluate whether you are here to give him more work, and then gestures vaguely at an empty corner. "Sit," he says, "or don't, as long as you don't hand me another form." You lower yourself onto a stool. A pile of scrolls sits to your right, labeled in sloppy handwriting, "Animals of questionable classification." You instantly love this room. The clerk dips his quill in ink and resumes writing while muttering to himself. "Bears, seals, beavers. Saints preserve me. I didn't sign up for this." He pauses and rubs the bridge of his nose. Why can't creatures just stay in one category? You smile sympathetically. Here it is, the paperwork phase of medieval theology, where logical leaps meet administrative exhaustion. And that's your mainstream historical fact for this section. Medieval clerical bureaucracy was very real and very capable of turning even simple issues, like which animals counted as fish for fasting, into a labyrinth of parchment trails. The clerk unfurls a new scroll, revealing a list of special circumstances. You notice beavers on it, with a note beside them. Tail resembles fish, acceptable during fasting. You have to suppress a laugh. The beaver tail loophole strikes again, then you notice a fresh entry. White sea bear, permitted on certain fast days. Underneath, someone has scribbled, "See testimony of northern clergy, classification pending." "A pending classification?" you ask gently. The clerk groans. Everything is pending classification. Ducks, chickens near rivers, large fish that walk on shore. Did you know someone tried to submit a request about a goat that liked to swim? He shudders. I refuse to answer that one. Another clerk pushes through the door, carrying an armful of trade invoices. He slams them onto a table and sighs dramatically. Merchants from the north brought sealskins, walrus ivory, and, he lowers his voice, something from a bear that looks like it sleeps inside a snowstorm. Your eyebrows lift. Polar bear fur? The clerk shrugs. They called it sea bear fur, and the merchants want to know whether selling it during fasting seasons needs special permission, because if it is a fish, perhaps the trade must go through the fish market, and if not, well. He gestures vaguely to the ceiling as if that explains everything. Medieval bureaucracy, a gentle nightmare. You watch as they try to sort the situation. One clerk digs through a chest labeled fish laws, while another flips through a manuscript called Edible Creatures for the Devout Household. They look like people who have spent their entire lives trying to fit the world into neat boxes and have just discovered the world has been deliberately spilling out of those boxes when they weren't looking. And here comes your quirky tidbit. There are records, admittedly sparse and regionally inconsistent, implying that some medieval communities did categorize odd semi-aquatic animals as fish for fasting, including creatures like puffins and certain waterfowl. Puffins, cute, waddling little seabirds, which means the idea of sliding polar bears into the same category was strange, but not entirely unprecedented. A young clerk approaches the main table holding a smaller parchment. "We received a letter from the bishop," he announces, clearing his throat. "He wants clarity." Everyone in the room groans in perfect, unified agony. The head clerk snatches the letter, skims it, and reads aloud. "To the honorable clerks of blah blah blah. I request a formal opinion on whether the great northern bear, known to swim fiercely in the cold seas, is to be considered among the fish, the beasts, or some new category of creature for the purposes of fasting, trade, and tithe." The clerk lowers the letter with a dead-eyed stare. Some new category? What does that even mean? Another clerk suggests, fish bear? Absolutely not. Sea beast? That's seals already. Half fish? Don't start. You sit quietly, watching them nibble stale bread while debating tax implications of labeling a polar bear as a fish. The absurdity is intoxicating, but beneath the humor lies something surprisingly human. These clerks are trying to make the world coherent, tidy, predictable, at least on parchment. But nature doesn't always cooperate, especially not polar bears. Historians still argue whether medieval administrations genuinely enforced such classifications, or whether these rules existed more on paper than in practice. Some claim the fish classification was mostly theoretical. Others believe that in northern regions it became a practical allowance tied to survival. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. The conversation shifts as an older clerk brings forward a more delicate issue. If, he begins slowly, if the sea bear is permitted during fasting, should we record its meat under fish tithes? Stunned silence. You watch as realization dawns on every face. Classifying polar bears as fish doesn't just affect what people eat. It affects taxes, trade privileges, fishing rights, markets, and even feast menus. One clerk sinks to his knees dramatically. "We've broken the system." Another pats him on the shoulder. "The system was broken already." Finally, the head clerk stands, clears his throat, and declares, "Until further evidence is received, we shall tentatively classify the white sea bear under the category of marine creatures permissible on certain fast days." He writes it carefully, sealing the document with a blob of red wax that looks like it's trying its best to be official. The clerks cheer, not loudly, mind you. This is still a monastery-adjacent environment, but quietly, with the deep relief of people who have finally resolved a problem without having to rewrite an entire chapter of canon law. You step outside into the crisp night air. Snowflakes drift lazily from the clouds, settling on your cloak. A faint warmth glows from the building behind you, where clerks continue to shuffle their papers and adjust classifications like medieval scientists, armed with quills instead of microscopes. As you walk back toward the village square, you feel a strange fondness for these bureaucrats. They didn't mean to invent a fish bear. They were simply trying to make sense of a creature that defied their categories. And sometimes the easiest answer is the silliest one. You smile, imagining a polar bear sliding off an iceberg into icy water. completely unaware that in this faraway parchment-covered office, someone has just placed it, quite officially, among the fish. You move through the village square, the night deepening into a velvet hush as the lanterns flicker and paint the snow in amber streaks. Your breath billows gently in front of you, curling into the air like lazy smoke. The world feels softened at the edges, and the cold carries that oddly crisp stillness you only get during winter nights, when everyone sensible is indoors, wrapped in blankets, probably eating something questionably classified. Your steps guide you toward a small wooden gate leading into a courtyard cluttered with crates, barrels, and, rather unexpectedly, a collection of animal pelts hanging from a line like a grim medieval laundry display. A trader stands beside them, lantern in hand, humming as he sorts through his goods. He's a compact man with a beard that looks like it's lost an argument with the wind, and he glances up with a half-smile of someone who enjoys company but isn't willing to admit it too enthusiastically. "You're here to buy or to listen?" he asks, raising a brow. You shrug. "Whichever gets me out of this cold." He chuckles and motions you over to stand beside one of the crates. "Then you're listening," he says, "and you've arrived just in time. I was just thinking about strange animals." You grin. "A common medieval hobby." "Indeed," he says with a mock solemnity. He taps a crate. "Inside here," he whispers, as though he's sharing state secrets, "is seal oil, completely normal. But," he leans closer, "in this crate over here is something more interesting. Beaver pelts." You nod, already anticipating where this is going. "And you've heard the rumors, I'm sure," the trader continues, "how the church lets you eat beaver tail on fast days because it's fish-like." He waggles his fingers dramatically. A marvel of logic. There's your quirky tidbit for the night. Medieval clerics did permit beaver tail during fasting because its scaly texture and aquatic lifestyle nudged it into fish territory. And apparently no one questioned this too deeply because, well, winters were hard and creativity cured hunger. But the trader isn't done. He reaches into a sack and pulls out something weird, long, and wooden? No, feathery. It's a carving of a goose perched on a driftwood-like base. "Ever heard of these?" he asks. "Barnacle geese?" you answer. His eyes light up. "So you have heard. They say these little creatures grow straight out of driftwood before dropping into the sea." He sighs wistfully, as if describing a magical childhood memory, which means they're not technically birds at all. You nod knowingly, because here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval Europeans believed barnacle geese literally hatched from driftwood and barnacles. Because no one had ever seen them nest locally, migratory behavior wasn't well understood, they assumed the geese emerged from the sea, making them fair game for fasting tables. The trader chuckles. Beavers are half fish, geese grow on trees, and now northern bears swim like seals. One wonders what category is left for actual fish. You laugh softly under your breath. The more you listen, the more you realize medieval Europeans lived in a universe where taxonomy wasn't grounded in biology. It was shaped by necessity, rumor, symbolic interpretation, and occasionally wild improvisation. The trader tosses the wooden goose aside and pulls out a rolled-up piece of parchment. "Here," he says, handing it to you. "A sketch brought by sailors. Look at this creature." You unroll the parchment to reveal a crude drawing. A polar bear depicted beside a seal, a whale, and what looks like a large, confused sheep. The bear stands upright, water droplets drawn like tiny dots around its paws. They said it stalks on ice, swims like a seal, and eats creatures the church calls fish, the trader says. So some folk up north consider it fish by association. Fish by association, you repeat, impressed. That's a new one. The trader laughs. Tell that to the monks. They're desperate to categorize everything, but the world is stranger than their ledgers want it to be. You roll the parchment back up, feeling the weight of the ink lines beneath your fingers. This drawing isn't anatomically accurate, it's slightly lumpy, proportionally dubious, but it captures something essential, the medieval sense that the natural world was a place of awe, mystery, and faintly comedic misunderstandings. You thank the trader and begin wandering through the courtyard again. Snow drifts lazily in the lantern glow. From a nearby stable, you hear muffled conversation. Curious, you approach and find two travelers warming themselves by a small portable brazier. One of them gestures animatedly. I tell you the bear is a cousin of the seal. They both eat fish, they both swim, they both live in icy places. His friend shakes his head. Nonsense. Bears are bears, but I will admit. He hesitates. If the church says beavers can be fish and geese can be trees, perhaps bears can be water beasts? You lean in, amused. The second man lowers his voice. Historians still argue whether these classifications were serious or merely local customs, he says. My cousin in the monastery insists the arguments went on for months. You realize you're listening to another example of medieval logic shaped not by firm scientific understanding, but by cultural dialogue, rural, urban, clerical, maritime. Each perspective blends into the next like watercolors bleeding into one another, and somewhere in that blend sits the polar bear, refusing to stay in one tidy category. You leave the stable and drift back onto the road, reflecting on what you've seen. Animals in medieval Europe weren't just physical creatures, they were symbols, lifestyles, loopholes, moral lessons, and occasionally excuses to eat something forbidden, but not quite forbidden. You recall the monks arguing over water behaviors, the clerk scribbling wildly, the traders negotiating classifications like merchants haggling over prices. And now these villagers comparing polar bears to seals and barnacle geese in one messy but earnest attempt to understand the world. You pause beneath a bare tree, branches dusted with frost. A stillness settles over you like a soft cloak, and you realize that among all the strange animal categories medieval people invented, the polar bear fits into a particularly odd corner. Not entirely beast, not entirely fish, and definitely not entirely understood. As you continue walking, the night deepens, and a faint northern breeze whispers through the trees. You imagine polar bears drifting silently across the Arctic ice, blissfully unaware that several hundred miles south, clerics, traders, and storytellers are trying desperately to decide whether these massive hunters should appear on fasting menus. Your steps carry you toward a dimly lit tavern where muffled laughter and the clatter of mugs suggest yet another round of animal classification debates. You smile softly to yourself. You can practically hear someone inside beginning a story with, "Now listen, I swear it was part fish. No bear swims like that." You continue onward, letting the night fold around you, carrying with you the charm of a world trying earnestly and hilariously to make sense of the creatures that lived just beyond its reach. You wander toward the tavern you spotted earlier, its warped wooden sign swaying lazily in the breeze like it's too tired to advertise properly. Light spills from the doorway in warm, flickering streaks, and the moment you step inside, you're hit with a wave of heat, noise, and that unmistakable medieval aroma of wood smoke, sweaty wool, and something stewing in a pot that's been boiling since the reign of Charlemagne. The room is bustling. Monks in travel cloaks sip ale beside merchants smelling faintly of fish. Sailors gesture wildly over mugs that slosh dangerously. And a few locals laugh with the easy looseness that comes from having enjoyed the tavern's finest "we swear it's fish" drink for a few hours now. You weave through the crowd until you find a corner table beside a hearth where the fire crackles and pops like it's delivering commentary on the conversation around it. A monk at the next table glances over and smiles. "Come to escape the cold?" he asks. You nod. "And maybe hear a story or two?" He chuckles. "Then you're in the right place." He raises his mug toward a nearby merchant who promptly slides over and plops down at your table like he's been waiting for an audience. "We were just discussing," the merchant says, "the great question of northern trade routes." He leans in dramatically. Specifically, what counts as fish on a menu. You grin. "Here we go." The merchant slaps his hands on the table. Up north, monks and traders have to negotiate everything. Fish versus meat, meat versus it lives in water so it doesn't count, and so on. He gestures toward a sailor nearby. This one here claims they ate seabird stew on a fast day. Seabird? "It swims," the sailor argues. "Sometimes. Barely. Still counts." The monk beside you stifles a laugh, sinking deeper into his hood. "We face these issues constantly," he murmurs. "Everywhere we travel, locals want exceptions." "Brother, can we eat this? It lives in water." "Brother, what about this? It sits near water." "Brother, this creature once looked at water. Does that count?" His expression is so solemn you almost believe him until he cracks a smile. There's your mainstream historical fact. Missionaries and church officials traveling to northern regions constantly encountered local diets that didn't fit neatly with fasting rules. With limited access to traditional allowed foods, communities turned to what the environment provided: seals, puffins, whales, beavers, and yes, occasionally polar bears. The church had to negotiate between doctrine and survival, sometimes bending categories like a blacksmith reshaping metal over fire. A serving woman drops a plate in front of you, a hearty dish of something that appears to be fish but has the suspicious shape of an overcooked bird. You poke it. It jiggles. You decide it's best not to investigate further. The sailor takes a seat at your table and lowers his voice. "You know why these questions matter so much?" He gestures around the tavern. "Winter, long winters, and when all the fish are gone, what's left? Seals, seabirds, sometimes bears." He shrugs. "People need food, and if you tell a starving village that seals are meat and forbidden on Fridays, well, good luck enforcing that." You nod. Necessity has a way of rewriting rules. A merchant raises a finger. But not just survival. Trade depends on classification, too. He leans forward with the energy of someone who has argued this before. If a creature is fish, it's handled by the fish market. If it's meat, the butchers want a share. If it's something else entirely, he throws up his hands. Chaos. The monk beside you nods. "We once had a fishmonger complain because walrus meat was being sold at the butcher's stall." "Walrus," the merchant says, pointing at you triumphantly, "is another confusing one. Lives in water, but enormous like an ox. So everyone fights over who gets to sell it." A woman at the next table chimes in. "I've heard some markets classify walrus as sea cattle." "Ridiculous," A butcher shouts from across the room. "You just want the tusks," the fishmonger yells back. You watch the argument escalate with the gentle amusement of someone enjoying medieval reality television. Here comes your quirky tidbit. There were medieval cities where otters, seals, and even porpoises were legally categorized as fish for the purposes of fasting and trade, showing just how flexible or chaotic classification could become. As the tavern gradually quiets, you listen to the murmurs of smaller conversations. A monk describing how northern missions rely heavily on marine animals. A trader explaining how supply caravans freeze in midwinter, forcing towns to rely on whatever the sea or ice provides. Sailors recounting their hunt for seals and occasional run-ins with mysterious white creatures that seem half ghost, half bear. You catch sight of a weathered man sitting alone, staring into the fire. He joins the conversation without lifting his eyes. "I've seen them," he murmurs, "the white ones. They come at dusk, silent on the ice. They slide into the sea as if water and land were the same to them." You sense the tavern lean into his words. "If that's not a creature of the sea," he says slowly, "then what is?" Historians still argue whether reports like these shaped clerical decisions, or whether the classification of polar bears as fish was more of a technical allowance than a belief in biological reality. But the feelings behind these claims, the awe, the practicality, the desire to fit the unfamiliar into a familiar framework, were undeniable. The merchant clears his throat and lightens the mood. "Tell him the story about Brother Martin," he says, nudging the monk. The monk groans. "Do I have to?" "Yes," the entire table demands. He sighs. "Fine. Brother Martin once tried to convince a fisherman that anything caught with a net counted as fish for fasting." "And?" you ask. "He accidentally permitted the consumption of otters, and possibly a drowned goat." The table erupts in laughter. Even you can't help but chuckle. As the laughter fades and the fire settles into a softer crackle, you lean back and absorb the charm of it all. Monks trying to enforce order, merchants navigating loopholes, sailors embracing the chaotic truth of the sea, and rural communities bending theology just enough to survive another winter. You feel the warmth of the hearth seeping into your bones, the soft chatter lulling you like distant waves against a ship's hull. And you understand now why polar bears, seals, beavers, and barnacle geese all ended up in this bizarre category-crossing universe. When life is harsh and the world unknown, humans will bend logic with surprising grace just to make things work. You stand, stretching slightly, and make your way toward the door. The tavern's warmth clings to you for a moment before the chill outside gently wraps around your shoulders again. As you continue down the snowy path, the echoes of merchants, monks, and sailors fade behind you. But their laughter and arguments linger like the warm glow of a candle, guiding you onward toward the next piece of this wonderfully tangled story. You leave the tavern's warm glow behind, stepping back into the quiet hush of the snowy village. Your breath rises in soft clouds, drifting upward like tiny white ghosts that vanish before they reach the dark sky. The road feels calmer now, less crowded, as if the whole world has slipped into a deeper, slower rhythm. You follow the lantern-lit path toward the outskirts of town, where the buildings thin out and the air takes on that crisp, untouched bite that makes you feel like the first person to breathe it in centuries. Ahead looms a set of wooden gates, simple but sturdy, marking the beginning of a long route northward. Strips of road missionaries and traders once followed into lands colder, stranger, and far more complicated than anyone in warm southern cities imagined. As you cross through, the wind shifts, carrying hints of pine, sea salt, and a faint scent of smoke from some distant hearth. It's quiet, almost reverent. Your boots crunch along the path as the terrain rises gently, leading you through sparse woods dusted in frost. Soon enough, you spot movement up ahead. 3 figures trudging slowly along the road, cloaks heavy with snow, packs tied with rope. Missionaries, the kind who wander into unfamiliar land, not just to preach doctrine, but to understand how people live when the world around them is frozen more often than not. You fall into step behind them just as they stop near a frozen stream. One of them, a young monk with an earnest face and a hood too big for his head, scrapes snow off a rock and sits down with a sigh. "I swear," he mutters, "every village has its own rule about seals." The older monk beside him chuckles. "Well, when the sea is your pantry," he says, "you learn not to argue with whatever swims your way." He adjusts his gloves, even if you're not entirely sure what category to place it in. And here's your mainstream historical fact. Northern frontier missions, especially in Scandinavia, Greenland, and other remote areas, forced church authorities to grapple with local diets extremely different from the agricultural norms of continental Europe. The fasting laws that worked well in Rome or Paris simply didn't map neatly onto places where most land animals migrated, hibernated, or were spiritually tied to older traditions. The third monk rummages through his pack and pulls out a rolled-up parchment. "We need clarity," he mutters. "The bishop wants consistency. The locals want exceptions. And we're stuck in the middle like frozen turnips." He spreads the parchment out on the snow. You peek over his shoulder. It's filled with lists: seal, fish; walrus, fish; puffin, fish; whale, definitely fish; bear, debatable. Each one followed by frantic notes and crossed-out arguments. Several ink blots suggest the author made these decisions during bouts of either deep frustration or very cold fingers. The younger monk sighs. "We just left a village where they insisted polar bears are fish." Fish. A bear. The older monk fixes him with a patient look. "Tell me," he says softly, "what do they eat in the winter?" The monk hesitates. "Mostly seals, occasionally bears." "And what did they offer us last night?" The younger one groans. "Bear stew." "Which," the older monk adds gently, "you ate." "Gladly." You stifle a laugh. The monk looks like a man whose worldview has been personally inconvenienced. "But," he insists, "a bear is still a bear." "Perhaps," the older monk says, "but if the bear behaves like a creature of the sea, and the people rely on it as such, what do you expect them to do?" "Starve." The younger monk mutters something that sounds suspiciously like an apology to both nature and theology. They continue walking, and you follow them through a narrowing section of forest, where branches bow low under heavy snow. The cold seems deeper here, amplified by the thick silence broken only by the crunch of boots and the occasional quirk of shifting ice. The missionaries speak softly, as if afraid of disturbing something ancient. One of them recalls another northern village. "There," he says, "they insisted puffins were fish because they swim, and monks before us agreed, so we had no grounds to argue." He rubs his hands together. "Then we arrived in another place where they said beavers were fish because their tails resembled scales." "And seals?" the young monk asks. "Oh, seals are definitely fish to them," the older monk says, "or something like fish. or fish with fur, or perhaps fish blessed by the cold. He shrugs. It varies. You smile at this because there it is, a living example of how classification for these communities wasn't strict or doctrinal. It was flexible, shaped by survival. And the missionaries, they're caught between the fine print of canon law and the far more persuasive realities of winter. Historians still argue whether the church formally sanctioned the idea of polar bears as fish in any centralized capacity, or whether it remained a regional practice shaped by necessity. Some argue missionaries created unofficial allowances to avoid alienating new converts. Others believe the classification simply evolved in pockets of Arctic life without much oversight. Now the missionaries reach a small settlement nestled in a hollow of frozen earth and evergreen trees. Smoke curls from chimneys. Dogs bark faintly. A group of villagers approach, bundled in thick furs, welcoming the monks with warm smiles and icy hands. After some greetings, the conversation drifts inevitably toward food. A local woman hands the monks a basket. Inside are strips of dried meat that look pale, tough, and vaguely mystery-flavored. The younger monk eyes them cautiously. "Fish?" he asks hopefully. The villagers exchange glances. Then one shrugs. "Yes, fish." The older monk nods politely, fully aware that this fish absolutely did not swim with fins. Later, inside a communal hall warmed by a roaring fire, the missionaries gather with the villagers. A storyteller begins recounting local traditions of seals that sing beneath the ice, of foxes with winter coats that shimmer like ghosts, of bears that walk across frozen rivers as if carved from the snow itself. "Those bears," the storyteller says, voice low, "are children of the sea. They hunt in water. They follow the seals. They return to the land only to rest." One missionary leans forward. "So you see them as water creatures?" The storyteller shrugs. "Sea children, ice children, bear fish. Words are less important than how they live." And there it is, your quirky tidbit. Some northern oral traditions, particularly Inuit, though medieval Europeans misunderstood these stories wildly, described polar bears in ways that blurred land and sea distinctions. Medieval travelers, hearing fragments of these tales, carried home interpretations that sometimes landed far from the original meaning. As the fire crackles, the missionaries exchange glances. They're witnessing firsthand how deeply environment shapes worldview. In a land where the sea provides everything, food, tools, clothing, it makes sense for powerful creatures of the ice to be considered part of that same system. You sit among them, feeling the warmth settle into your bones as the fire pops softly. Snow taps gently at the shutters like a sleepy guest. The monks look thoughtful, humbled, maybe even a little transformed. Their tidy categories have met the northern frontier, and the frontier is winning. When they finally rise to leave, the storyteller presses a hand to his chest. "Where the sea rules," he says, "the creatures obey different laws." Outside, the night is crisp and deep, and the stars shimmer like ice crystals suspended in the heavens. You follow the missionaries as they walk back toward the road, their silhouettes blending with the snowy world around them. And you understand now, classification in this cold edge of Europe isn't just theory. It's a negotiation between survival, tradition, and belief, a negotiation that shaped the fate of the fish bear in ways the church never expected. You follow the missionaries' trail back toward the main road, but instead of turning south toward the comforts of warmer towns, your path draws you gently eastward into a quieter stretch of countryside. The snow deepens here, soft and pillowy, muffling every footstep until you feel like you're walking through a dream. A thin ribbon of moonlight drapes across the hills, pale as parchment, and the farther you go, the more the world starts to feel less like a village outskirts and more like the inside of an old book, silent, still, waiting for you to turn the next page. After a long stretch of snowy quiet, you spot another glow in the distance, this one softer than the tavern's raucous warmth or the monastery's stern austerity. You climb a gentle rise and find yourself standing before a low timber hall with wide windows glowing amber from the inside. A carved wooden sign hangs above the door, swaying gently in the breeze. History and Voyage. Scribes at work. You push open the door, and a waft of warm, book-scented air envelops you like a hug from someone who lives indoors and reads too much. A group of men in thick woolen robes sit at a long central table, quills scratching, pages rustling. These aren't monks, at least not officially. They're chroniclers, copyists, early naturalists, the medieval equivalent of travel vloggers armed with parchment instead of GoPros. One looks up from his writing and waves you inside. "Come in, traveler," he says. "We're compiling reports from the northern seas. Dangerous work if you value accuracy." You settle beside them, and immediately your eyes drift to the manuscripts spread across the table. Some are neat, with crisp lettering and careful illustrations. Others look like the writer was cold, tired, and possibly attacked by a goose mid-sentence. The variety alone tells you everything. Medieval natural history is a glorious mess. One chronicler flips open a manuscript depicting a creature that looks vaguely like a polar bear. White fur, long snout, standing on its hind legs, but with the oddly human-eyed expression medieval artists loved giving animals. "This," he says, "is the northern ice bear." You lean closer. "And what have you learned about it?" He snorts. "Conflicting things, as always." He taps the parchment. "Some say it is a giant beast that tears ships apart. Others claim it moves like a ghost, silent, nearly invisible against the snow." One man insisted it could smell a man's breath across a frozen mile. He rolls his eyes affectionately. "Sailors exaggerate. It's practically a professional requirement." You smile. And there's your mainstream historical fact. Early natural history texts relied heavily on sailors' reports, which mixed real observation with guesswork, fear, and storytelling flair. It took centuries for direct scientific observation to correct those colorful descriptions. Another chronicler leans in. "We're trying to sort the legends from the likely truths," he says. But the North remains stubborn. He gestures around the room. "Every time we think we understand something, another traveler arrives with a story that contradicts the last. One manuscript in front of him lists polar bear traits like a medieval pros and cons chart. Swims like a fish, hunts like a wolf, lives on ice, eats seals, walks on land, looks like snow gained sentience. Then, in the margin, is it fish or bear? Scholars disagree. You stifle a laugh. Even here, in a place devoted to studying the natural world, the fish-bear debate lingers like a persistent cold. Across the table, a younger chronicler perks up. "I heard a claim," he says, "that the white bears dig dens in the snow to sleep." Another nods. "Yes, and they live solitary lives except when raising cubs." The first one frowns. "But someone else told me they travel in great herds." "Ridiculous," the second says. "You weren't there." "I didn't need to be. Herding bears?" "Nonsense." You watch their bickering, amused. And think of how historians still argue whether some medieval descriptions of polar bears were misidentified whales or seals, or whether those chroniclers simply didn't understand what they were hearing from sailors. The lack of consistent observation allowed wild speculation to flourish. A nearby scribe gently pushes his spectacles up his nose. We only recently began to describe animals by their physical structure rather than their moral significance, he explains. It will take time before we untangle all the old stories from the emerging truth. He picks up another book, a travel narrative from the early 1500s. Some explorers wrote that polar bears were monsters, he continues, part spirit, part flesh. Others called them gentle giants. And some thought they were simply white-colored brown bears driven north by the cold. He chuckles. Historians still argue whether these accounts represent different species or just different levels of observation. He gestures toward a stack of pages. Read enough of these and you start to see the shift, knowledge turning slowly from legend into study. You trace your fingers along the edge of one manuscript. Its ink is newer, cleaner, more confident. It describes the polar bear not as a symbol, not as a theological riddle, but as an animal, an apex predator adapted to the sea ice, with specific hunting methods and diets. The chronicler sees your interest. Travelers brought back more accurate accounts as navigation improved. He explains. Observation replaced hearsay, and slowly, gently, the fish bear idea lost its hold. A mischievous glimmer flickers in his eyes, but don't think it vanished instantly. Oh no. Some insisted for decades that the white sea bear must remain a fasting fish because tradition said so. You know how people are. You nod knowingly. Humans cling to convenient loopholes with surprising tenacity. As the chroniclers continue to work, the room fills with the soft scratch of quills, the gentle turning of pages, the slow, steady pulse of knowledge shifting from myth to reality. You sink deeper into the warmth of the hall, feeling sleepier with each passing moment. The fire crackles softly. A scribe yawns. Someone makes tea that smells faintly of herbs and soot. You listen as the oldest chronicler sighs contentedly. One day, he says, we shall classify animals not by superstition or appetite, but by truth. But until then, he rolls his quill between his fingers. We do the best we can with what we have. You stand quietly thanking them and slip back into the night. The door closes behind you with a soft thump. Outside, the world feels changed, clearer somehow. You breathe in the sharp air and smile. The story is shifting. The fish bear is becoming a real bear again. But its place in legend? That part isn't going anywhere. You leave the chronicler's warm hall behind, stepping once more into the hush of the winter night. The snow here lies smooth and untouched, glowing faintly in the moonlight like a blank page waiting for the next sentence. Your breath fogs the air in small, steady puffs, each one dissolving almost instantly into the quiet. And as you walk, the stillness wraps around you, making it easy, almost inevitable, to think about how stories linger long after facts have politely updated themselves. The path curves gently downhill, lined with bare trees that creak softly in the breeze. Their branches stretch overhead like bony frost-covered fingers, pointing the way forward. You follow them, boots crunching softly, until the outline of another settlement appears in the distance, a larger town this time, its wooden palisade walls rising from the snow like a half-buried rib cage. Lanterns flicker above the gate. A guard wrapped in wolf pelts waves you through with a yawn. Inside, the village square bustles with nighttime activity. Merchants close their stalls, fishermen unload their last catch, and a few women carry baskets of dried herbs from door to door. Even at this hour, the town feels alive. People laugh, argue, gossip. Exactly the kind of environment where old stories never really die. They just find new ears. You drift toward a group of townsfolk gathered around a fire pit in the center of the square. Their breath swirls upward in glowing clouds as they trade tales the way children trade shiny pebbles. Just as you approach, an older man leans in conspiratorially and says, "And that's why you should never turn your back on a snowbank. Sometimes it's a bear." The group erupts in laughter. One woman shakes her head. "A bear, maybe. A fish? Absolutely not." You suppress a smile. Here it is, the legacy of the fish bear. Not doctrine anymore, not theology or survival necessity or canon law, bureaucracy. No, now it's something simpler and far more enduring. A joke, a curiosity. A bit of folklore that stubbornly clings to conversation like the last grain of flour clings to dough. You take a seat on a nearby bench as the discussion continues. A younger fellow grins and says, "My grandfather told me his grandfather claimed that polar bears were considered fish in his day." "And what did his grandfather say?" someone asks. "That they tasted excellent on Fridays." The laughter returns, warm and rolling like waves against a frozen shore. You can tell most of these people don't believe the old classifications anymore, but they know of them. The fish bear has become a kind of local legend, a charming reminder of a time when the world was bigger, stranger, and more negotiable. A woman points toward the north with a dramatic flourish. "Up in Tromsø, they still say the white bears came from the sea itself. Not born, summoned by the tide." Another man nods. "My uncle swore he saw one rise from a crack in the ice as if the ocean pushed it out." The fire cracks and sends sparks spiraling into the dark. Someone stirs the embers and adds, "Well, they are still sea beasts at heart, always swimming, always following the seals." A fisherman snorts. "Yes, yes, and next you'll tell me puffins grow from pine cones." The group giggles again. You watch their faces, glowing orange in the firelight. What was once a serious theological question has become folklore, beautifully persistent, hilariously embellished folklore. That's your mainstream historical fact for this section. Even after naturalists reclassified polar bears properly in later centuries, the myth of the fish bear lingered stubbornly in storytelling, jokes, regional customs, and travelers' tales. Still, not all the remnants are playful. At the edge of the group, an elderly woman lifts her chin thoughtfully. "It's not all foolishness," she says. "My grandmother believed the bears split their lives between two worlds, land and ocean, and that the sea claimed them more fiercely." She gazes northward, eyes soft. "She said any creature that hunts below the ice honors the sea's laws." Her tone is gentle, but her words carry a strange weight, the echo of older beliefs, a quirky tidbit. In some scattered traditions, animals that crossed boundaries, air to water, land to sea, day to night, were thought to have special status, liminal creatures doing the work of both realms. The polar bear fit that bill far too neatly. As the fire crackles on, the stories get wilder. One man describes a bear so large it dragged a boat across an ice floe. Another insists he heard a tale of a fishmonger who tried to sell bear meat at the market, claiming it had been caught with a net. The crowd laughs at this, but you can tell they enjoy the absurdity too much to let it go. Historians still argue whether these lingering stories came directly from medieval classifications or whether they evolved independently as travelers added their own spice to the stew of folklore. Maybe both. Memory is a messy creature after all, much like the polar bear in question. You wander away from the fire, drifting toward the outer edge of the village where the snow lies unbroken, the buildings thin, giving way to open fields and starlit silence. A lone wooden pier extends over a half-frozen river, the water beneath glimmering like a mirror stretched between worlds. You walk slowly onto the pier, the boards creaking beneath your feet. Something about this place feels contemplative, as if it remembers stories, too. You think back on everything you've seen, monks arguing passionately over categories, clerks drowning in paperwork, sailors telling half-true tales, villagers embracing the absurd with delighted warmth. And through it all, the polar bear stands tall, unchanged by human attempts to box it in. You lean on the railing as the cold air brushes your face. Somewhere far north, real polar bears roam in quiet majesty, their paws whispering over ice as they move between land and sea without caring which one humans think they belong to. The river burbles softly beneath you. You breathe deep, letting the crisp air fill your lungs. The old fish bear classification is gone, but the story, oh the story, is very much alive. A soft wind blows, carrying the faintest hint of sea salt, as if the north itself is exhaling. You push gently off the railing and turn back toward the snowy path, the lights of the village glowing faint behind you. The tale continues ahead, drifting slowly toward the era when science begins to replace speculation. But before you reach that part, you take one last look at the night sky, a shimmering canvas that would have baffled any medieval cartographer, and whisper to the lingering legend, "Not bad for a fish." You follow the snowy road out of the village, the laughter and stories fading behind you like the dying glow of embers. The path unwinds before you, pale under the moon, stretching into a darkness that feels less like night and more like a long exhale. As you walk, the air shifts, crisper, sharper, like the world itself is preparing for a change. And in a way, it is, because the era you're stepping into now is the one where curiosity begins loosening the grip of old assumptions, where observation starts elbowing aside imagination, and where the medieval fish bear slowly becomes a bear again. Not all at once, of course. This transition moves with glacial patience, appropriate, really, for a creature that lives among glaciers. You crest a small hill and see the silhouette of a coastal outpost below, its cluster of wooden buildings huddled close against the wind. But unlike the earlier towns you pass through, this one feels different. Not chaotic, not bustling with heated debate, but quiet in the deliberate, thoughtful way of a place used to watching the world and taking notes. You step inside a long hall lit by lanterns and warmed by a central hearth. The air smells of burning pine and salt water. Tables line the walls, each piled with journals, maps, sketches, compass instruments, and early scientific tools that look like they were designed by someone who had enthusiasm, but only a vague understanding of physics. A few scholars sit scattered through the room, travelers, naturalists, amateur explorers, forming a sort of early research hub you might call the medieval to Renaissance knowledge pipeline. A tall woman wrapped in thick furs looks up as you enter. "Ah," she says with a friendly nod. "Another traveler hoping to make sense of the North." You nod. She waves you over to her table, where a collection of notes lies stacked in tidy columns. She taps one sheet, an anatomical sketch of a polar bear drawn with surprising accuracy. We just received reports from a voyage farther north than most have ever sailed, she explains. Real observations, not hearsay. Her voice warms with excitement. It seems we're finally seeing the creature up close. There's your mainstream historical fact. By the 16th and 17th centuries, early explorers, whalers, naturalists, and adventurers began documenting Arctic wildlife directly. Their accounts weren't perfect, but they were grounded in reality rather than monastery debates or tavern stories. You lean closer. The sketch shows powerful limbs, thick fur, sharp claws, details no medieval artist, guessing from sailor gossip, could have captured. You trace the curve of its back with your eyes. You've seen them. Not myself, she says, but I've spoken with men who have. They say the polar bear is no spirit, no half-fish creature, no mythic iceborne beast, just a predator. She pauses, reconsiders. Well, not just a predator, a marvel, a creature built for cold in a way we can barely understand. Across the hall, another scholar spreads out a map dotted with ink marks and scribbled notes. Look here, he says loudly. Tracks along the ice, dens dug into snowdrifts, bears swimming between floes. They cross land and sea with equal ease, but that does not make them fish. The room murmurs in agreement, though a few older researchers look faintly disappointed. Perhaps they like the old stories better. One man, clearly a sailor from his weathered face and salt-tangled beard, adds, "Saw one chase a seal into the water myself, fast as anything. But when it climbed back onto the ice, it shook itself just like a dog." He chuckles. No fish does that. You grin. In the old days, that detail alone could have prompted another round of medieval theologians tearing their hair out. The tall woman flips to another page. This one a list of behaviors. Hunts seals, swims long distances, grows fat in summer, lean in winter, fierce when hungry, protective of cubs. She smiles softly. No monster, just an animal. But she doesn't go so far as to say everything is settled. Instead, she adds, though historians still argue whether early explorers exaggerated the bear's size to impress patrons. She rolls her eyes. Scholars do love a good argument. You drift toward another table where a young naturalist is sketching a polar bear's skull from memory. What fascinates me, he muses, is how long the old fish classification persisted. Even as new information arrived, jokes and customs clung to the older ideas. People don't change their minds easily. You chuckle. I've noticed. He gestures toward an older manuscript lying open beside him. Some regions still refer to the polar bear as sea bear. Not incorrect, mind you. The Latin name eventually becomes Ursus maritimus, sea bear, but for scientific reasons, not dietary ones. He smirks. Imagine trying to explain that to a medieval monk. You imagine it. The monk would likely either faint or start a new category. Fish by name, bear by habit, confusing to everyone involved. You continue exploring the hall, drifting between tables. Scholars argue politely about taxonomy. Sailors describe real encounters instead of ghost stories. Artists draw bears from specimens brought south, fur, bones, teeth, rather than from imagination. This place, this moment, feels like the turning of a page in humanity's understanding of the natural world. Here comes your quirky tidbit. Early naturalists sometimes dissected marine animals right on the docks after expeditions returned, drawing crowds of curious onlookers who weren't sure whether they were watching science or some sort of street performance. One chronicler laughs as he describes an early attempt to examine a polar bear paw. 5 men lifting it, 3 men arguing about it, and 1 man fainting because he thought it winked at him. You stroll toward the far end of the hall where an older scholar with silver hair is rolling up a map. He looks thoughtful, almost wistful. "Strange, isn't it?" he murmurs. "How long ideas linger." "Even after we prove otherwise." He glances at you. "We know now the polar bear is no fish, yet in taverns people still joke. In villages, old sermons still mention the bear of the sea. In markets, merchants still swap tales about fish bears during Lent." You nod. "Stories outlive classifications." "Indeed," he says. "Facts sharpen the picture, but stories give it shape." He sets the map aside and leans on his cane. It will take many years for science to travel far enough north to see the polar bear as it truly is. Longer still for the wider world to forget the old category debates, and some never will. He chuckles softly. "Sometimes I think the fish bear will outlive all of us." You walk outside with that thought in mind. The cold rushes back, but now it feels invigorating, full of clarity rather than confusion. Above you, the stars glitter with icy brilliance, as though someone spilled crushed quartz across the heavens. You picture the polar bear in its true environment, padding silently over ice, nose lifted to catch scents miles away, swimming through frigid seas with muscles built for the cold. A creature of land and sea, but never fish. A creature shaped by climate and evolution, not theology or tax law. You take a deep breath. The night is vast, the journey long, and the story still unfolding. But as you head down the snowy path, you sense the tale drifting toward its final chapter, toward the soft edges of understanding, wonder, and sleep. You follow the pale path onward, the snow stretching ahead in a gentle ribbon as the night deepens into a quiet so soft it feels like velvet pressed against your ears. The world has changed around you. They don't ring the bells of monasteries here. No merchants shout about half-fish beavers or bargain-price barnacle geese. This final stretch feels almost outside of time, as if you've stepped into the white threshold between waking and dreaming. Up ahead, the land opens into a wide slope overlooking a frozen shoreline. The moonlight catches on the ice, turning everything silver blue, like the whole landscape is exhaling in slow motion. You walk out onto the shore, the snow muffling your steps, and pause to look across the frozen sea. The vastness is almost overwhelming. One of those moments when you forget everything except how small you are compared to the world. The horizon stretches into darkness, where the ice merges with clouds, and you can't tell where earth ends and sky begins. It's fitting, you think, that this is where the fish bear story melts away, a place where lines blur, categories dissolve, and the cold quiet reveals the truth more simply than any medieval monk ever could. A crackle of ice echoes across the bay. You turn and spot a small group approaching, travelers wrapped in furs, carrying packs and lanterns. Not monks, not sailors, not clerks or merchants. These are modern explorers, naturalists, scientists, voices of the present slipping softly into the edge of the past. They move with calm, confident strides, their boots crunching in slow, deliberate rhythm. When they see you, they smile and wave, setting their packs down near a jut of sea-worn rock. One of them, a woman with frost clinging to her hood like powdered sugar, kneels and unfolds a map. Not a medieval dream map filled with sea monsters, but a clean, crisp satellite image of Arctic terrain. We tracked one earlier today, she says, a female with 2 cubs heading toward drift ice. She points to a cluster of marks. They crossed here. You can still see the tracks. You follow her gesture, and sure enough, half-buried paw prints trail across the snow like soft, rounded impressions, each one wide enough to swallow your whole hand. They lead toward the frozen sea, fading into the brightness where the ice begins. You step closer and notice delicate snow crystals caught inside the prints, sparkling like tiny stars. You touch the edge of one, feeling its cold whisper against your glove. Beautiful, isn't it? A young researcher says behind you. They're perfect for this world. Thick fur, black skin to catch sunlight, paws shaped like snowshoes. He grins. A bear. Completely and absolutely a bear. And here comes your mainstream historical fact. As modern zoology developed in the 18th and 19th centuries, scientists observed polar bears directly and classified them accurately as marine mammals, related to brown bears, adapted to the Arctic environment, dependent on sea ice for hunting, but unmistakably mammals in every biological sense. Still, the fish bear myth didn't vanish entirely. Another researcher laughs as she opens her notebook. You know, I still get questions from tourists asking whether the old fish classification was real. She shrugs. And sometimes we tell them yes, because it's too good a story to waste. She blows into her hands for warmth. People love the quirks of history, she says. It reminds us how strange the world once felt, and still feels, sometimes. You walk a few steps away, gazing out over the frozen ocean. The ice groans occasionally, shifting under its own weight, like some ancient giant stirring in its sleep. A faint ripple of color shimmers across the sky, pale green, then blue, the first brushstrokes of aurora. They ripple quietly, like soft curtains moving in a breeze you can't feel. The scientists around you fall silent, their conversations sinking into awe. You think back to all the people who tried to classify the polar bear, monks scribbling moral lessons, clerks drowning in paperwork, sailors with frostbitten fingers, describing creatures that felt more magical than real. And now, here, in the crisp clarity of modern understanding, the polar bear stands unambiguously itself. But that doesn't mean the old stories are useless or silly. Historians still argue whether the polar bear's fish status was ever widespread or merely a patchwork of local customs, misunderstandings, and survival-driven compromises. The truth is probably a blend, as it so often is with history. Yet the story matters, not for what it got wrong, but for what it reveals. Humans will always try to understand the world using whatever knowledge, creativity, and humor they have. A soft wind brushes your face. You take one slow breath, then another, letting the Arctic air expand gently in your lungs. It's colder than anything medieval Europeans ever imagined, and far more beautiful. You picture a polar bear somewhere out on the ice, its massive form blending into the snow, its paws whispering over frozen crust, its breath rising like smoke into the pale sky. Not a fish, not a loophole, not a theological riddle, just a bear, built for this world, shaped by this cold, moving with a power and silence that needs no embellishment. You take one last look at the frozen horizon. The aurora brightens, curling like a ribbon of light over the dark sea. The explorers gather their gear. The wind eases into a slow, steady hum, and you turn toward the path, ready to drift from the icy clarity of truth back toward the warm, soft quiet of sleep. The snow softens under your feet as you begin your gentle walk back from the frozen shore, the cold losing its sharpness and settling instead into something calm, steady, and strangely comforting. Each breath feels slower now, deeper, as though the entire world is encouraging you to relax, to let your thoughts drift like loose flakes in a quiet snowfall. The road unfolds in long, slow curves, and the lanterns glowing in the distance shimmer a little, their light hazy and warm, like candles seen through half-closed eyes. The sounds around you grow faint, the whisper of the wind, the faint groan of distant ice, the soft crunch of snow fading into a barely there rhythm that matches the rise and fall of your breathing. Even the sky overhead seems to stretch into a smoother, gentler shade, the aurora's colors thinning into pale strokes that shimmer like the last traces of a dream. Everything that once felt sharp now feels rounded, softened, slower. With every step, the story you've walked through begins to settle, the details drifting quietly into place. Medieval monks debating by candlelight, sailors whispering over tankards, clerks drowning in parchment, legends floating like snowflakes through winter towns. They blur together as your mind slips into a calmer state, leaving behind only the easy warmth of their memory. The world narrows to the soft glow ahead, the comforting cold at your cheeks, the quiet weight of your eyelids. Even the thought of the great white bear becomes something serene, a distant silhouette gliding across ice, moving slowly and steadily toward a horizon that grows dimmer and more peaceful with each passing moment.